This is Week 1, Session D, Isthmian Games. Hello and welcome back to our Agon Institute instructional videos. My name is Dr. Greg Linville. I serve as a professor for this course. And we are helping you, a student who's trying to conceptualize your 21st century's models of sports ministry. We're helping you understand some of the historical background of faith and sport throughout the centuries. And this will help you and I to figure out where we're going in terms of our modern day models, learning from models of the past. The previous few lectures in this particular Week 1 had to do with learning about the Crown Games. There were 4 Crown Games. We've talked already about the Olympic Games, the most prestigious to participate in and win, but the least attended. We talked about the Pythian Games in Delphi and the Nemean Games in Isthmia. And yet we have indicated that while the first century athletics and the first century church would have known about all these sites, that the one we come to today, the Isthmian Games, is probably the one that is the most influential and impactful in terms of the scriptures that were written, because this would have been the games and the game site that the Apostle Paul would have most interacted with. Before I went to Greece, and before I had boots on the ground to really go and see these sites for myself, I had a nagging doubt in my mind. Was I putting too much into this? In other words, because I love sport and my career has been in sports ministry, was I reading things into the scripture that really weren't there? Like that Paul really knew about these places. Paul had really visited these places. And my boots on the ground research indicated to me that yes, it would be a stretch to say that Paul ever went to the Pythian Games up in Delphi. It's maybe a little more likely that he would have gone to Olympia. After all, it was one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, and he had an interest in these kinds of things. But it really comes down to Isthmia in my mind, that we have the clearest biblical references and the clearest extra-biblical references and identifications that Paul would have intersected with Isthmia. Let me tell you my own personal experience that when I drove from Athens to Corinth on a modern-day highway, it went right past and through the Isthmian Game site area, right there. The ancient trailway would have gone right through there. When Paul walked or rode from from Athens to Corinth, and you can see this in the passages in chapter 17 of Acts, he would have walked right through this. This was part and parcel of what he would have seen. And so I really do believe that when Paul references athletics, that he has the Isthmian Games and the Isthmian Game sites well up in his mind. On your picture here, you will see in your first slide for this section 3 different pictures that give us the Isthmian Games. Now the Isthmian Games, up in the left-hand corner, the site there is of the temple to Poseidon. Poseidon, of course, is the god of the seas. And you see, because this little isthmus of land that connected northern Greece with the Peloponnesian Peninsula where the Olympic Games were, so up here was the Delphian Games, and then Athens, and then the road comes across this little stretch of land. This is why they were called the Isthmian Games, because they were on the isthmus. And the reason that Corinth grew into the most wealthy and influential city of that era was because of the commercialization that came there, because the road from Athens to the Peloponnese went through the land routes, and also the sea routes coming from the Gulf of Corinth and into the Sardonic Gulf, these 2 bodies of water that were separated by this little isthmus. All the boats would come there, and either, if they were too big, the cargo would be loaded on carts and carried across the small stretch of land, or else smaller ships would actually be rolled up and rolled across the land to get to the other side to circumvent going around the very dangerous sailing waters around the Peloponnesian Peninsula. So this is why the Isthmian Games were the most attended and the most participated in, and in some ways the most critical games of the first century era. And remember, they were held every 2 years, not every 4. So Poseidon, being this god of the two waters, this is why he was the god that they were dedicated to. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see the starting blocks in a recessed kind of way, and then the starting blocks that we'll come back to in the major picture there. Now, this is again the most likely the background for 2 Timothy chapter 4, 6 to 8, and 1 Corinthians 9, 24 and following. This site was excavated by Oscar Bronier, who spent a lifetime on behalf of the University of Chicago excavating and detailing this site. Now let me give you a sense of it. He would go like about a foot square and about a quarter of an inch deep and sweep away all of the dust and keep going down, down, down until he found these artifacts. And every quarter or half inch or so, they would draw another. They wouldn't even take pictures. They would just draw another picture, hand-drawn. And this is how he spent his life. And what you see in these pictures are what he excavated, but what you don't see as you look at those pictures of the runners' blocks where the runners would start, is you don't see the long stadium out in front, because that has not been excavated yet. Modern houses and modern day situations are still there, and I believe that a modern day archaeologist, if we could get that property and go through it, we would see some amazing artifacts that would continue to verify our biblical foray into this. Now your next slide, you'll see the husplex, this runner's starting blocks, if you will. And at the top, you'll see that it's kind of like boring down into it, looking from the top down. You see the little hole? You see that's where the starter stood in that hole, and he held in his hands all the strings that came from these crossbars. So you have a wooden bar here, a crossbar, and then the string would pull, and then the crossbar would fall, the runner would take off. Now this was a very amazing technological advance of a starting blocks that was here at Isthmia for the first time. And so if you remember back in the picture of when I stood in that circle, there were little, and you can see on the upper drawing here, you can see there's little lines where the strings would actually come down through the concrete, the rock there. It wasn't concrete, it was a rock, so that the lines would not trip up the runners. This was a very ingenious invention in that day. The next picture that you see of Isthmia is looking from the temple of Poseidon all the way across down into the plain, and you would see down the stones in the far down by the trees that those would have been the remnants of the athletic village where the athletes would stay. And this was in the foreground the ruins of the temple to Poseidon. Your next slide, you'll see again where this was located, right there on the isthmus, and that this place at Isthmia had a small theater. It had a beautiful temple in honor of Poseidon. It was located just outside of Corinth. So now, in the upper right-hand corner, you see an artist's rendering of how these temples would look. And on the upper left-hand, you would see one of those temples in the background, the Temple of Apollo, and that's actually a picture of Corinth, just where Isthmia was just outside of. A couple other pictures here to help you understand the grandeur of this. You see that this floor is a mosaic. Now, can you imagine Bronier and his students hundreds of years ago that began to uncover this unbelievably intact mosaic, this most beautiful floor? And you see the ocean theme of the dolphins, the octopus, the various fish, again because of the aquatic nature of Poseidon. This was the floor of the bathhouse where these athletes would come in Isthmia. This is why the athletes wanted to come to Isthmia, because they were pampered. This was unbelievable. Now you'll see in your next slide, you'll see the underneath of the bathhouse. Every one of those pillars would have been built up to a certain level, and then a floor would have been laid that you see. And this would have been beside the bathhouse where the mosaic is, you'll see that this would have been the sauna room, if you will. At the far end, you see there's a place where the hot water from the hot springs would have flowed in, hundreds of degrees in temperature, and then up and out of that, the steam would raise and get into the sauna, if you will, for the athletes. And so the hot steam heat treating athletic injuries and restoring athletes is something that is ancient, in the same way that many of these concepts are ancient to us, but they are so similar to what we have today. And so we are then able to take what we are learning from this ancient time and apply them to our modern day models. Well, let me wrap this section up by saying to you that the Isthmian site is where the Isthmian Games that Paul would have seen, that he would have wrote about in the 4th chapter of Timothy and the 9th chapter of Corinth and other places. These are the references that Paul would have had. And these are the references that you and many other sports ministers in our sports outreach movement, these are the ones that we reference today. And the purpose of these lectures are to help you get a pictorial sense of all that went on during that time, so that we have a better sense of knowing how to teach in our modern day models. Hope this gives you some background. And again, we will teach this more in depth in our ancient history course that we will teach in this Agon series, another course. Next time, we move out of the Greek games into the Roman games. This is Dr. Greg Linville for the Agon Institute. Thank you for joining.